I think it was really enlightening and exciting to hear that these are the benefits that executives are seeing and starting to realize that they need systems to be able to ride through some of the business challenges that they're facing. So the first was operational continuity and resilience. And so, more and more businesses are being impacted by power outages. We're seeing 2 times more weather-related outages in 2014 through 2023 than we did, in the 9 years previous to that. So severe weather events are having more of an impact. We've talked about the aging grid, how it's more vulnerable to these changing weather events. And just the fact that the grid is aging on its own makes it more susceptible to impacts. And so with more and more power outages, we're also seeing more and more businesses being impacted. And some of the costs that we talk about are staggering.
All right, welcome back, listeners. We've had some pretty amazing episodes the last few weeks, and really appreciate our recent guests. Excited to dig in with you today, Gareth. We're going to dive into some pretty interesting findings that came out of a recent workshop that we co-hosted with over 70 executives from large corporates, and the findings are rather interesting. So I guess without delay, let's dive into things. Gareth, maybe you can set the scene for us. So I know that this event was done in collaboration with some others, and you had some tee up ahead of time, but you're standing in front of 70 executives. What happened?
Yeah, well, I think for many of our listeners, they may not be aware, but we're lucky enough at VECKTA to be a part of a program called Engage. And Engage is a conglomeration of some of the major Fortune 500 corporates based out of the Southeast US, particularly Atlanta. And this covers your Coca-Colas, your Chick-fil-A's, your Deltas, your UPS's, your Georgia Powers, sort of mega businesses who have been hyper successful. They've seen many trends come and go, and they've typically done a really good job of reading the tea leaves, adapting to the market conditions, and continuing to be leaders in their respective industries. And so super exciting opportunity where Engage decided to run an energy forum. And so this pulled together many executives from these Fortune 500 companies. And the opportunity was to discuss the risks and opportunities of the on-site energy, the energy transition in general. And what was super awesome about it is we held it in the Candida building, which is one of only, I think, 8 or 10 buildings that have qualified for the Living Building certification. So these are buildings that are net positive. And so this building in Atlanta is net positive energy and water over the course of a year. And I think the thing that blew me away the most was, I think the stat was up to 90% of the products used in building this building were actually recycled and, pulled out of landfills. And it's wood and it's metal, and it was just super awesome. So first of all, it was really inspiring to be in that building. And then secondly, it started off with me being on a panel hosted by Bill, who was on our show just a few episodes ago. And we're talking about how utilities and the likes of ourselves see the energy transition, and particularly on-site energy systems. And I think the thing that stood out for me the most was we're talking about grid interactive buildings, and that being the future of where the industry is heading. The biggest challenge is when you think about the transition. If you don't think about energy, which can be complex and scary, just think about a big water tank sat in the middle of your town holding water. And all of us as businesses and residents get water that flows from that tank. So use gravity, water comes down the pipes, we all get water, we consume the water, the utility manages that, everyone's happy. But then what happens is some people who are into the living building challenge, like scenario, they start capturing some of their own water and storing it and using it on site. And so now the big water tank is needed a little bit less because people are meeting some of their own needs. But then the next iteration of that is we start collecting in so much of our own and being so efficient at how we use that water that now we want to push it back into the tank for storage and be compensated for it. And so it was a really good analogy to see how the challenge that the utility faces when the whole business model is being flipped on its head. And then here we are saying we absolutely want that latter scenario, people storing and generating their own resources where they need it and not having to be reliant on other people. And if they overproduce, being able to use it like a commodity and get compensated for it. So that was a super cool discussion. But I think for the purpose of today's episode, we ran a workshop all afternoon and we had the honor of chatting about what are the barriers to adoption of on-site energy and what are the benefits. And I teed up the session by just really re-educating people as to what are we actually talking about when we talk about on-site energy. And so for our listeners, just to reaffirm this, we're talking about systems that are built at a business location. This can be on a roof, in a car park, on spare land. It's generating and storing energy right where we need it. It doesn't have to be renewable only. It can be gas, it can be fuel cell, it can be solar, it can be battery, it can be EV for storage. It can also be wind in some cases. But it's been able to use the right combination of technologies to meet whatever your specific business needs and objectives are, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then people use terms like microgrids. And so a microgrid is just a version of that, but it has a controller, almost a brain, that allows you to now island from the grid and operate fully disconnected from the grid. If you don't have that controller, you have to always stay tied to it. When there's a grid problem, you have to also shut down. So obviously the value of being microgridable is that you have autonomous ability to operate when there are grid problems. And really what we talked about was when you get this right, it is really the only option that we have in today's market to be able to manage your costs, manage your resilience, and manage your sustainability versus the other options that are available, buying carbon credits, buying off-site virtual power purchase agreements. So it was really good to kind of set the scene, but also discuss that less than 3% of buildings in the US today have on-site energy systems or don't even have solar, let alone a hybrid on-site energy system. And so I think, Dan, it'd be exciting to get into why are we not seeing more and more of these systems being deployed, especially in light of a lot of the trends we've been talking about from a cost, resilience, and sustainability perspective.
Yeah, let's dive into that in a minute. One point that you had me thinking about when you were talking about the kind of the water tower analogy and kind of the new role for utilities. It just made me think of the growth of the ability of prosumers, if you will, and we've got some partners in the demand response world, and I just actually got an outreach from them informing us that in PJM, which is the independent system operator, and largely in large portions of the Northeast, that the upcoming capacity market program for 2025-26 runs from June through May of 25 through 26. The payment values for the demand response program, which is the capacity market program, will be at historic highs. Meaning, when they call demand response events, the companies that meet those reductions in consumption from their grid will be paid the most that has ever happened. And so that we're starting to see the movements get made, and that's at an independent system operator level. There's many utilities that fall within that territory, and when businesses think about participating in those programs, some have operations where they can easily shed load or reduce load and not have operations or their revenue generation potential impacted too much. Others just simply can't. However, with an on-site system, and as you talked about, a bit of a controller, you can respond to those signals from the utility or from the ISO, maintain your operations, and have the best of both worlds. Continue to make your widgets and get revenue from not using grid electricity. So it's really fascinating, and I think we're going to continue to see business leaders look for opportunities to take advantage of those opportunities.
You're absolutely spot on, Dan. I think that was a big part of the grid interactive buildings discussion is, there is a lot of low-hanging fruit, at a very minimum, being able to know how much energy your building is consuming, when it's consuming it, how it's consuming it is almost like the minimum buy-in for any business. Like you have to have the monitoring and control technology for your business to understand how can you shed loads in an event like that to be able to capture the benefits. The energy system allows you to supercharge that, but the base entry point is get a handle on your actual energy consumption right up front.
Certainly. Well, it actually makes me think that we should probably get one of our experts from the demand response world here on do an episode of the podcast talking about the dynamics of those markets and how people can participate and what the realities are. So we'll dive in deeper on that on a future episode. But coming back to the workshop, let's start on the benefit side, and then we can go into some of the barriers that were identified. But what were the kind of, call it, the most sought after benefits that these executives highlighted?
Yeah, I don't think there'll be any major surprises here, but I think it was really enlightening and exciting to hear that these are the benefits that executives are seeing and starting to realize that they need systems to be able to ride through some of the business challenges that they're facing. So the first was operational continuity and resilience. And so, more and more businesses are being impacted by power outages. We're seeing 2 times more weather-related outages in 2014 through 2023 than we did, in the 9 years previous to that. So severe weather events are having more of an impact. We've talked about the aging grid, how it's more vulnerable to these changing weather events. And just the fact that the grid is aging on its own makes it more susceptible to impacts. And so with more and more power outages, we're also seeing more and more businesses being impacted. And some of the costs that we talk about are staggering. At the low end, you're talking about single digit tens of thousands, maybe an inconvenience because you're having to shut down a line or send employees home. But at the big end of the spectrum, you're talking about $1 million plus an hour, $1 million plus a day. We've talked about in the past the Samsungs of the world through the Texas cold snaps losing over $350 million in a week, not just as a result of their business being impacted during that week, but losing a lot of equipment that, was not recoverable because it was processing like molten metals and things like that. So I think businesses are realizing, one, there's a direct impact, but two, by being community members, they are looked to be there for the community when things go wrong. And more businesses realize that, one, there's a responsibility for that, but there's also a real branding and reputation opportunity to be the business that can keep the lights on, provide shelter, provide food or water, or just a place to shelter, when things aren't going as planned.
Yeah. The one thing that I'd add from some recent conversations, this is coming out of one of the largest logistics companies globally, is as businesses start to automate, bring in more robotics, electrify their operations, whether it's taking things from what has historically been gas and thermal loads, or just taking what have historically been human-driven manual processes and automating them with robotics. The quality of power coming into their facilities, as well as the reliability of the power, will just get that much more compounded. So that was a concern that was highlighted to me as this particular business talks about electrifying, automating, and bringing in more robotics into their operations.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely have to do an entire episode down on the power quality issues, because we're seeing and hearing a lot more of that. And I think I was reading the stat the other day, and we'll reaffirm it when we record the actual episode, but it's something like businesses are paying a 7 to 9% premium on their utility tariff, not directly in the form of an energy cost, but in wear and tear on their equipment as a result of these power voltage fluctuations. So there's all these hidden costs as well that businesses aren't aware of. If now you're having to replace a piece of equipment at year 8 or 9 versus year 10, like that's a capital expense, but it's just constantly chipping away at your business. And so there needs to be mitigation measures for that.
What was the next most sought after benefit?
Yeah, this one was obviously the big one. confidence to run your business with certainty of cost is obviously massive for every business. In order to be profitable, you need to know what your cost inputs are. I think the biggest risk every executive identified was energy costs are going up. They're going to continue to go up, but how much they're going to go up is almost a bigger risk. So, and how unpredictable that is. How do you plan for a 20% escalation next year, and then 40% the year later, and then 5% the year after that? It's very hard to predict, and that creates a lot of uncertainty and risk for businesses. And I think the reality is many business leaders today, if they could have locked in their energy costs 20 years ago, they would have done, and they're kicking themselves now. But that's the reality of the benefits on-site energy brings, is you can lock in your energy costs today for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that's incredibly powerful when it comes to an input to your business that typically makes up between 5 and 40% of your operating costs. And without it, you can't run anything.
You arguably could not have pulled together this workshop 5 years ago.
No.
Back in 2020, when you looked at the prior years from 2014 to 2020, across the US, the average electricity increase across that 6-year period was 1.3%, far less than inflation across a 6-year period. In fact, 23 states, their electricity prices went down during that time frame. Now, over the last 5 years, from 2020 to 2024, average increase across the country, 23%, with only 2 states having their electricity prices go down. So that's just highlighting the fact that this is making its way into boardrooms, allowing you to pull together workshops that are attended by such high caliber companies and high caliber leaders within those companies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really setting in now. It actually doesn't really matter what the administration does. It doesn't matter what the new sort of stance is on renewables or oil and gas. The reality is the grid has been operating the same way for 100 years, and it can't continue to operate the way it has been. And we need to be able to get power to where it's needed. And I even looked at my home bill the other day, Dan, and from a $200 bill, only $25 of that was generation. And then the rest of it was delivery. And then I think a tiny bit of gas on top of that. But my generation usage is minuscule in comparison to the transmission distribution costs. And that's because utilities are having to dump so much money into this. So I think that's a major risk to every business that we deal with.
And what was the third benefit that was highlighted?
And this one's definitely more forward thinking and more innovative, I think, as more businesses are looking to manage their costs, but also seek new revenue streams. It's, we've talked a little bit about this. We did with Brendan Wallace on a former podcast episode, is seeing real estate as being profits hidden in plain sight. Today we fill a box really well, but how do we use the parcel of land and the roof of the property and maximize that to generate new either revenue streams and or manage those operating costs and expenses that we talked about, but then getting the added benefit of decarbonization. And we talked about this on the last episode around sustainability tension. And this is a huge opportunity. I don't think businesses realize that those that get it right and do a really good job of deploying decarbonized products and offerings, attract and retain the best talent, attract better financing, sell more equipment or products or people than they previously did. Their share price is better. So the stackable benefits are huge, and the more progressive businesses are realizing that.
And we're seeing it with, like, for example, retail asset owners looking for any ancillary revenue stream. In fact, I've met a handful of folks recently where ancillary revenue is a part of their title. They're looking for any way to generate revenue beyond the tenants and the leases that they have for the insides of the building. And I think EV charging has probably made the best headway in this, where
Yeah.
they're renting out parking stalls and getting that revenue stream, and then letting the EV charging companies handle everything else. We're going to see more of that, where companies are either going to want to invest themselves and generate their own revenue through power to their tenants, or just lease a roof to a developer. So we'll see how this continues to go, but it's how do we maximize the existing assets that we have to drive the most enterprise value.
Yeah.
Well, Gareth, it wasn't all roses. There was a handful of barriers. I think that I wish I was in the room and talking through this, where everybody's like, wow, we see a lot of the great things that this can do, but boy, there's some things that are standing in front of us for us to be able to get it done. And it seemed like those largely fell into 5 buckets. Maybe you can share what those were, and then we can dive into each one for a minute or two.
Yeah, I think, there's obviously lots of points on this, but I think they can be grouped into those 5 categories of implementation, especially in the planning and strategy side, the contractors that you ultimately work with. How do you make a really confident buying decision? The financial metrics and the financial projections around these systems, the actual construction side of it and the risks and opportunities associated with that, and then the technology choices that support the delivery. So I think it's worth us starting with the implementation side. And I think it's no real surprise that for many businesses, particularly those with multiple sites, especially if they're spread across the country or across a region, we've talked about this lots before. There's so many variables that can impact the business case for these systems, ranging from utility tariffs to how you consume energy, to the size of your property, to incentives. There's lots of things that factor into this. And for a lot of businesses, they just didn't have the data, the confidence, the intelligence to know, where does this even make sense to me? Where am I going to get my greatest return on investment?
That, and I think the thing that jumped out at me from a conversation, in fact, that I had this morning with one of the largest lab companies, and when I was reading through some of the notes from this workshop, was talking about cutting through the bureaucracy of getting from, hey, that seems like something's great there, to actually getting a project procured and ultimately permitted and constructed. I was talking to this lab that has a couple hundred facilities around the country, that they've got 2 projects that they've identified that they've been working on, and today they're at indicative pricing from a couple different firms, and that's taken them 3 years to get to that point.
Wow.
And so when I started peeling back the onion on why that was the case, and it was largely because there's 5 or 6 or different not just leaders and individuals, but kind of business units that need to be involved in the decision process. And so bringing them together, ensuring that everybody's on the same page to then say, these are the right places, these are the terms that we need to see in agreements, I think will ultimately speed things up, because this group wants to be doing 5, 10, 15 projects a year, but they've struggled to kind of get out of their own way in this process.
Yeah. And I think this really comes back to the last episode we did in terms of finding those sweet spots, isn't it? And it's getting the multi-stakeholder, the multi-business unit, the different roles and responsibilities, the different bonus structures. Everyone's got their own reason and priority for wanting to do something. And everyone's got competing needs and objectives. And it always comes down to dollars and cents. There's only so many dollars that can be invested in the business. So critically being able to assess, where can I truly find that sweet spot of the biggest return on investment, the biggest bang for buck, the least pain, the least impact to our operations, the highest value opportunity. Being able to cut through all that noise super quickly and efficiently and get people circled around a single source of truth is really valuable, isn't it? And I think this is what we're working towards every day, is instantaneous access to tailored results and insights and intelligence that allows all those stakeholders to feel really awesome about progressing down this route.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Number 2, Dan, was I think for purposes of this conversation, is like the financial metrics. So a lot of things were brought up here in terms of meeting internal financial thresholds. And one that I found really interesting, everyone has their return on investment, IRR thresholds. We typically help customers see what are the lifetime savings of a project, what are the IRR, the NPV, the return on investment. But one company in particular said, the business case has to be net positive in year one. It doesn't have to, even if it's 10 or 20 grand more positive than what our current base case is, our utility power, then we'll do it. But it has to pencil in year one, otherwise we won't look at it. So I thought that was super interesting. Every business has got a slightly different financial way of looking at these projects. The trade-off between, do you want to finance a system and sink in your own capital and the upfront costs, or do you want someone else to finance a system, own it, manage it, maintain it? How do you deal with the availability of different policies and incentives that are changing? And we're seeing this in real time. You've just been experiencing this with REAP grants. Do you want to just share with our listeners about how this is quite a dynamic market right now?
Yeah, the other thing that it made me think of is the firm that you were referring to that needed to see year one.
Yeah,
that really just points to a PPA. Nobody's going to be able to see kind of year one benefits if they're having to invest in it, but they can in situations where you have zero upfront cost. You're just paying a lower price per kilowatt hour, and you can start to see those benefits.
That's right.
We're seeing that with, for example, REAP grants with the new administration coming in, a lot of the freezing of different government grant programs. So some of those are going away, or at the very least, they're getting delayed. We're also seeing, the stick side of things. We touched on previous episodes, the WARE program. There's another one here in California, AB 98 for new builds. And so we're seeing, in some cases, the carrots that were there going away, or at least temporarily going away, and more sticks coming in, which only impacts the calculus of these projects. Whether grants going away maybe makes them not as attractive, or fines coming in makes them more attractive, because you're going to be able to avoid those.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for companies those bills are going to be, starting to become due on some of these fines. And so now, once it's hitting them in the bottom line, they're going to start to look for ways that they can avoid those.
Yeah. And I'd say, I went to see a panel discussion yesterday at Cleantech San Diego. And while there's, I wouldn't say confidence, but I think there's almost a expectation that most of the IRA should survive, or at least the ITC and things that impact on-site energy systems. For any business that is concerned about that, you've likely got a year window to go and maximize the opportunity to guarantee yourself access to some of these incentives. And so it's really important to know what's available, when it's available, should I act now? Because if you can get a system for 30 to 50% off the actual base price point, and you want to do that system, you shouldn't be taking any risks and waiting and stalling and delaying, especially when the savings from that system will, very quickly pay for the system itself. But if you keep delaying, and now you're not only losing the opportunity to be realizing those energy cost savings, but you risk losing incentives, it becomes a double whammy. So I think very important for businesses to be aware of that. And I think just for stakeholders within the organizations thinking about the financial aspects, it's just really important to understand what are the key metrics that your business makes decisions around, and being able to sell a business case on that basis. I think that's almost the biggest thing. And particularly we see this with sustainability individuals, don't we, Dan? It's like ops and other people who have competed for capital always typically know how to play the game. But if you're coming in from a sustainability angle and you're trying to sell some of the softer metrics, unless you know how to tell that capital story really efficiently and compete for that capital, sometimes it can create some headwinds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Completely agree.
The next one was around technology. And I think this one's super interesting because, there's some comments around, well, if solar and batteries and gas turbines and those capabilities are improving so dramatically, and the costs are coming down so significantly, why don't I just keep waiting and wait for the technology to get better and better when I get a better return on investment? So I thought that was a very interesting observation. I think you've got some thoughts around that, Dan.
Yeah, I'll come back to some of the stats that I shared on the kind of changes in electricity prices up until 2020, and then since 2020, where that argument was absolutely held water when you were looking at that first 6 years of 2014 to 2020. Because the electricity prices largely didn't change. So yeah, there was a motivation to wait for the panel costs to come down and efficiencies to go up. We are going to continue to see panel costs come down over the next 10 years. Efficiencies are going to improve as well, but they're not going to improve quite as much. But the cost of labor is gonna eat into some of those margins. So when you start to look at things at a total cost to install perspective, it's going to start to keep things relatively even, whereas electricity prices are going to go up. So your electricity overspend by not deploying something today is going to outweigh your gains in panel cost reduction that are going to come in the coming years. And then not to mention, who knows what's going to happen to tariffs that are getting slapped on these products. I was very encouraged the other day when I saw some figures on domestic content and kind of the expected growth of that between now and 2030. But the demand for domestic content, meaning panels and batteries that are built here in the U.S., because they get some premium from a tax credit perspective, the demand for those is incredibly high, and it's going to be difficult to compete for them. So yeah. I think really what it comes down to is if you've got a great business case today, get going.
Yeah.
You're going to reap those benefits, and use the cost gains if that is an argument, especially companies that have dozens, hundreds of facilities. Use the cost reductions in panels and the efficiency gains in panels for your mediocre projects that you're not going to tackle today anyways, because you've got some great projects to get after.
Yeah. And the second part of the technology piece was, what technology should I be deploying? And this is kind of near and dear to our hearts, is, make sure you're designing a system that meets your business objectives. And I think that's key to this question, is why are you building the system in the first place? Is it cost? Is it resilience? Is it sustainability? Is it a combination? Knowing what your local constraints are, knowing what your energy consumption profile is, and that will influence what combination of technologies makes the most sense for you, what size they should be, and how they should operate. So it's really important to not get sucked into just buying solar because someone's trying to sell you solar. Like, really prove that solar is right for your facility. Maybe it's a battery, maybe it's a gas turbine, maybe it's all three. Really make sure you assess what solution is right for you.
Mm-hmm.
Then we get on to the whole the actual deployment of these systems. And a big part of this was around both the construction and the contractors. So on the construction side, it was concerns relating to timing of deploying these systems, permitting, safety, as well as roof warranties was a particular concern for some people. How do you ensure that when you're installing solar, as an example, that you're not going to damage the roof and end up with leaks, especially if these are new roofs, and then the distance between panels and the usage footprint trade-off. And so I think these are all pretty common concerns in people's minds who haven't deployed these systems. And I think you can overcome these by partnering with the right developers who are doing this all day, every day. They know the building codes, they know the standards, they know the permitting requirements. They do this day in, day out. They know how the system works. They know, if you have an old roof and you want to replace the roof, you can get it all done at the same time. So I think these are valid concerns, but they shouldn't be if you spec your project right, you go to market with the right requests, you make sure you procure the right solution with the right developer, and that developer is then responsible for the performance guarantees, the warranties, making sure that the system performs as operated, and that you have the right insurance in place to support the asset operating properly.
Certainly. Makes me think we were just talking earlier about probably getting an episode going over some safety concerns, because that does seem to be popping up more and more recently. We've seen some unfortunate battery related fires here in California, but I think those are back to some old technology before some of the more recent certification standards came into place. But some of that comes down to workmanship, and we've got a fun guest that we'll get on the podcast to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the other final point I'll make is, there was a question around, I've got lots of projects. Surely I can just hire one developer? But we know that the best developers are often very good in their particular local region. And so if you've got a bunch of projects that are in the same region, yes, we see there being higher buying power by being able to bundle those projects. But once you start getting into different states, different sides of the country, likely the developer that you've used on the West Coast is not going to be the same one that you want to use on the East Coast. And you're definitely not going to get the best deal. You're definitely not going to have the local labor preferred rates. You're not going to have the permitting expertise. So it's really important that you bundle projects in the right locations, but then you also are going to market and getting quotes from the best suppliers for your particular project in your particular regions.
One just note of caution that I might throw out, and it's just, I've seen it a handful of times, but it's just come about again over the last couple of weeks, is this idea of, I met a developer, or an EPC. They've done a bunch of work for me and helping, answering a bunch of my questions and helping me figure out what we should do. And I'm not taking anything away from any of that work. It's important work that needs to be done. But a lot of times it's done either to lock someone into doing a development agreement where you have to work with them for a 6-month, 12-month period, and they try to take you off the market, or it's done from a more psychological perspective in this idea of reciprocity. And I've studied some psychology. Robert Cialdini, who's one of my favorite psychologists, talks about reciprocity being one of the core principles of influence. The reason I bring it up is I've been talking to a gentleman with a pretty large facility that has done this with a developer, and I can tell he's very concerned about kind of not severing ties, but just damaging his relationship with them because of all the free consulting that's been done. But in looking at some of the numbers, it looks like the contract that's been put in front of him is about, between the solar and storage, about $1.5 million higher than what we would expect, and what we've actually tested with a couple others in the market this man should get. Well, the free advice, I'm using air quotes here, advice that he's received from this one that has done a bunch of work for him, I mean, that can't be more than $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 worth of kind of engineering consulting work. Certainly not $1.5 million to overspend on buying a project. So wanted to bring that up, and this happens all too often, where you get a bunch of great feedback, and then you end up paying a premium that may not be necessary.
Yeah. And we talked about this in the car episode, didn't we? The lightning purchasing scenario. You want to be able to walk into that car dealership armed with the data, the intelligence. Want to know what car you're going to buy, what price it should be, and which brand you want to buy from. You don't want to walk in and have the sales guy tell you what car you're going to drive, why you're going to drive it, what financing structure you're going to take. So this is all about having the data and the intelligence to be in the power position of this buying equation and flip the script on the information asymmetry, because today developers have a lot more data and control over the process than the buy side of the market. And we definitely need to continue to challenge that. They were the big outcomes, Dan. I think the only thing I'd close out by saying is, there's a few things that, as more and more businesses are considering this and thinking about deploying these systems, there are the individual property side of it, but we all talked about there's huge potential to look at this at a portfolio scale, and also to think about the opportunities of almost evergreen funds within the businesses to deploy these systems, because if you can put money into the first deployment, start realizing the cost savings, reinvesting those cost savings back into your evergreen fund of development, that'll pay for future projects. And so you actually need very little capital to begin with to start reaping very big compounding benefits. But that is only possible by getting the right senior leadership involved early, engaging them early, showing the opportunities at scale. And then really, I think a big ask for all our listeners would be, we need more and more people to be advocating for the partnerships and the opportunities to work in collaboration with utilities to ensure that these systems are supported, both from a policy and interconnection and an operating and commercial standpoint, because we need to make sure that these systems are already commercially viable on merit, but they can be hyper viable if you can start getting rewarded for resilience, if you can start getting rewarded for supporting those demand response calls that you mentioned at the start. So there's lots of ways we continue to add stackable benefits to these opportunities, but it requires them to be supported federally, regionally, from each utility. So continue to advocate and drive for it.
No doubt. And just I think with anything worth doing, there can be challenges and roadblocks sitting in the way, but none of this is insurmountable. And the good news is, for anybody out there that has not yet done any of the done an on-site energy project, you're not the first. And those that have done a handful or even dozens, the ability to do them faster, more efficiently, is certainly achievable. So I appreciate your time, and I appreciate the time of the executives coming together to dig into this. I think we're going to see this become more of an annual thing, and excited that it's finally getting the airplay that it needs to.
Yeah, it was awesome. And it's great to see on-site energy being on corporate radar, because it's really one of the biggest levers they have in their business today to make huge strides in terms of cost management, in terms of continuity, in terms of brand and awareness. So yeah, massive untapped market. We talk about those profits hidden in plain sight. And so let's get after it. Let's unlock those profits. Let's do it in a really sustainable way. And let's go and crush this market.
Cheers.
All right. Cheers, Dan.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.